Hello and welcome to Molo Molo African Tech Stories. I'm your host, Dr. Bolan Conte, and together we'll be discovering the fascinating stories of tech innovators and entrepreneurs that are shaping the future of the African continent. Today is an interesting story. We will be traveling to the land of Egypt, the land of the pharaohs, but a specific time. And I will read the background story, at least the context that will give us an introduction to our tech hero. In the pre-World War II era, Egypt faced socioeconomic challenges as it navigated through the global economic depression of the 1930s. The country was still under British influence, and the Egyptian population experienced economic hardships. The agricultural sector, a significant part of Egypt's economy, struggled due to failing commodity prices affecting farmers' livelihoods. Urban areas witnessed a growing disparity between the affluent elite and the working class. Limited job opportunities and low wages characterized urban life, leading to increased poverty levels. The political landscape was marked by anti colonial sentiments, with movements advocating for independence gaining traction. The influence of foreign powers, particularly the British, impacted the aspirations of Egyptians for self determination. 10 years later, although, post World War II, in fact, Egypt underwent significant changes, both politically and socially. The war's aftermath brought a surge of nationalism, and specifically in 1952, the Egyptian Revolution led to the establishment of the Republic of Egypt. This marked the end of British influence, fostering a sense of national pride and autonomy. Interesting backdrop now. Of course, this is our first champion, and her name is Dr. Samira Moussa. Most of you might not have heard this name, but if you do, if you have, it's an incredible story of resilience and, more importantly, a trailblazer that all of us as Africans should be inspiring to emulate. Let me give a bit of a biography for Dr. Samira Moussa. Dr. Samira Moussa, an Egyptian nuclear physicist, born in 1917, had a remarkable life marked by pioneering contribution to both science and society. Her mother, at an early age, died from cancer. Her father, Musa Ali, was a famous political activist. A trailblazer for women in STEM, Dr. Musa earned her doctorate in atomic radiation in 1948, becoming the first Egyptian woman to obtain a PhD in atomic science. Committed to the peaceful application of nuclear energy, she envisions making medical treatments accessible and affordable for all. Dr. Musa's groundbreaking research focused on using nuclear technology for medicinal purposes, particularly in cancer treatment. Tragically, her life was cut short in 1952, and when she died under mysterious circumstances at the age of 35. But despite her untimely end, Dr. Musa's legacy endures as a symbol of scientific excellence and pioneer in advocating for the beneficial use of nuclear energy for the betterment of humanity. Wow, what a story. But this is Molo Molo, and we need to break down. We need to talk about her within the context of technology. What is nuclear technology? Now, I'm not going to go through the details, all right? This is not a podcast on nuclear physics. For sure, it's not a podcast on atomic energy or in general, or should I say more specifically, we're not really going to dive deeper into the intricacies of what it takes for Dr. Musa. At least she's not here. She passed away a long time ago, into how she achieved the PhD. But what we're going to be doing, although, is we're going to be asking quite a few questions, which I think is quite important and something that we can all learn from and understand how we are able to apply it to our own lives. if you were to reflect the story, this was a particular interesting time. When I think of Egypt during that time, some of you might remember the movie The Mummy. If you at least those who lived in South Africa or who are listening from South Africa would know that The Mummy was such a big movie on the TV screen, whether you watched ETV or SABC, which is a South African broadcasting channel. The Mummy played almost all the time, and we were fascinated as teenagers on the Egyptian kind of pursuit for treasure inside the mummies and the mummification of, and also the sorcery behind it. But more importantly, if you were to, when I think about it now, as someone who reflects on the movie with respect to what we just read and the background, because that's really in the 1930s and 1940s and 1950s, is that there was an obvious colonization happening. It was very much British. That's why it was so easy to see characters being played by Egyptians who were quite well spoken in English. But at the backdrop of that, there was an imbalance. There was an imbalance of people who didn't have. There was an imbalance of people who had too much. There was an imbalance on what it meant to be Egyptian, what it meant to have self-determination, which all of us want. And so Dr. Musa was born and bred during that time. She potentially saw numerous protests in her teens and in her early adolescence. Her father was an activist, as the story has shown us. Even though her mother died, one can only imagine she went everywhere her father went, if indeed she had a responsible and an active father. She saw what it meant to talk about and discuss and uphold Egyptian values. Now, the question is, why atomic science? Well, if you go through your history books, you will also know that post World War II, there was already a huge amount of research, but more importantly, of interest on nuclear energy. And that was the focus on both the British, who had won World War II with the Americans, but the whole world in general was looking at different types of energy, not just for the use of military purposes, but in actual fact, with Dr. Musa's help, the use of nuclear energy for medicinal purposes. What does that mean? Now, you may not know this, but nuclear energy is all around us. One good example is the nuclear energy that is used every single day on patients throughout the world in an X ray machine. An X ray machine is using nuclear energy. Now, you may ask, how does that work? That's a different topic on its own. But to simplify it, it's quite straightforward. The X-ray machine, through the work of Sameera Moussa and her observations and her colleagues during that time, which made her a pioneer, found out that it was possible to harness the ionization process, which essentially means the freeing of electrons from different materials that were accelerated to a point where it freed, in this case, X-rays, or allowed energy to permeate from from a collision of electrons that allowed the scanning process that could result in us knowing what's going on in different materials, including our bodies or other materials for that matter. Now, of course, there are many, many more, um, if I can put it this way, there are many more observations that have been made through that time and today. It's a really interesting research. I mean, I'm an engineer, right? So I'm not a physicist, but what can be said for sure is that nuclear physics on its own is is an incredible science about discovering things that our eyes do not see. And that must have reflected a lot with Samira Musa, Dr. Musa, mainly because during that time, there were a lot of things that your eyes didn't see, but your mind and your heart did. What do I mean by that? I mean that for her, if you were to think of context, she eventually, I didn't read on the story, but she eventually moved, or at least had a brief period in London where she attended one of the few women-only colleges in the University of, I think the University of Bedford, if I'm not mistaken. And there, she also got to discover things that potentially her mind could not, when she was in, at least in Egypt, not have comprehended, which is a world where women are able to study, women are able to discover what it means to apply their mind versus the traditional, at least I'm sure from an Egyptian perspective, where the wife was subjugated to being a housewife. Here she was, brilliant mind, really pushing science and the knowledge base forward. Now, that is an incredible, incredible story that one should really take a step back and try and figure out what does that mean for us. Samira Musa, or at least I should call her Dr. Samira Moussa, definitely gives us an impression that she was a trailblazer. She was someone who definitely pushed the envelope. She didn't back down of all the uncertainties that she might have had coming from Egypt into the colonial power of the United Kingdom. She could have been completely and utterly overwhelmed. Maybe she had friends and family waiting for her, I highly doubt it. So she was fundamentally alone with her family back home. And I can relate to that. In the previous podcast, I tried to give a bit of a summary of who I was. And it's quite interesting because there is a certain level of sadness that comes with being alone and having to do things alone. But there's also a certain level of comfort that comes with that. What do I mean? Well, being alone really gives you a sense that it's all on you. It's all on you and no one else. If you succeed, then you succeed. And if you fail, it's just you. Now, why is that a comfort? It's a comfort for me, at least, because it allows me to zone in on the things I need to do to make it work. I need to do. But also, it allows me to zone in on getting help on the things that are stopping me from making it work. Again, it's all on me. And I do believe that sense of focus that potentially Dr. Samira Musa had allowed her to really zone in on her research, to really apply herself, to really figure out what does she have to do to really push the envelope. But more importantly, what are the fundamental answers that haven't been answered yet? Because that's essentially what a doctorate degree gives you the privilege to do. It gives you a privilege to ask those questions. And that's really important. Now, of course, when we think about X-ray machines and just so much technology that goes with it, and so many research papers and so many observation that has allowed us to have an X-ray machine pretty much in every corner of the world today. You go to a rural Cameroonian village, you will find, albeit potentially old and outdated, you will find an X-ray machine. And that was the work, amongst others, of Dr. Samira Moussa, who fundamentally wanted the X-ray to be something that can be available for all, and she achieved it. She did. Of course, she wasn't alone, right? And we're not going to talk about her tragic history and what happened to her when who did what in the accident. And I know a lot of people focus on that and trying to figure out what to make sense of it. And was the Israeli involved, and Mossad, and maybe Egyptian didn't want the Egyptians to have nuclear energy because they were leaning towards Russia, and the Cold War that was upcoming, and blah 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 blah. I don't. Yes, I'm not saying it's not important, but I do think there's a bigger question to ask, which is, how do we learn as Africans, as intellectuals, as people who really want to be better, do better, and think better? What do we learn from Dr. Musa? And there's a couple of things when I think of her and I think of her story. One of the things that I know what I had to learn very quickly during my studies for my doctorate was I gotta I've gotta be able to ask the right questions. I remember there was a point in time in my research where I was stuck. Literally, I was stuck. I didn't know how to move forward. I was stuck mainly because not from a lack of funding or from a lack of support. I was stuck from a lack of cognitive understanding of what is it that I want out of this research. What is it that I want? Not what my professor wants, not what the school wants, not what my boss who is giving me time off wants, but what do I want? That's the beauty, I think, of doing a PhD, is that it gives you the freedom to dwell in your thoughts, to dwell in the unknown. And some people crumble because it's just too dark and too too scary, right? To really dwell with your own m- thoughts and doubts. But if you push through the chaos or the chasm of of the unknown, what you find is this clarity of train of thought, this clarity of hypothesis, this clarity of methodology, the clarity of understanding that indeed you are adding to the body of knowledge. Indeed, you are worthy of defending this topic. And that, for me, I can only imagine how she must have felt having those breakthroughs. That indeed having nuclear energy being available for all in as cheap as she put it, I think as cheap as an aspirin, she put it, available for all and as cheap as an aspirin. She achieved it. Wow, absolutely amazing. So it does require some level of clarity, but also, when I think of her and I think of what it means to study um, and obtain a doctorate, it does require you to, like I said, think critically, but to collaborate. I mean, I didn't really get a chance to collaborate with many people. Fundamentally, I worked by myself and I was a bit of a loner. I did actually my PhD part time, which I absolutely do not suggest. I, when I think about it now, I mean, I wouldn't do it any other way, but man, was it tough. I mean, I registered fundamentally part time, although my professor wanted me to do it full time. I registered part time, but I had a job. I remember very clearly that I had Samson, who's my son. He's 8 now, but at the time he was 2. He was 24 months when I made the decision. And I also remember at the time I I didn't really have a very laid back job. I had a lot going on, and specifically there was a flight test, which is a flight test campaign. Basically, just means in the world of aerospace, it just means that you are literally about to test your product live. And in our world, what it means is you have this huge operation and logistical, um, drumbeat that basically requires you to go to a flight test site, which is usually quite far away from your actual headquarters. You have to travel there, set up there, perform things early in the morning, data analysis late at night, and fundamentally away from family. And in my case, I had to keep on trying to ask those questions for my research to move forward over a period of roughly 18 months when I was quite involved in the flight testing campaign for work. And that's what I mean by I don't recommend it, do it part time. But here I am. It didn't kill me. Well, anyway, I think I'm still sane, but it does require teamwork. I do remember my professor having to rely on him and having to rely on his ability to speak um, to my heart. And what I mean by speak to my heart, I mean his ability to really talk talk to me about my self doubt and trying to figure out what that means for me to change and for me to ask the right questions. And that was quite important. I do remember that was quite important for me to realign my understanding of where am I going, the clarity of thought that I just spoke about. That requires teamwork. That requires collaboration. That requires the willingness to open up and be vulnerable about your thoughts. And I do believe Samira Moussa potentially was an expert at that. She was able to garner support and garner teamwork. I mean, to the point where she went to the United States. United States invited her um, for nuclear research and to carry on. She was even, well, rumors say that she was even offered a U.S. Citizenship, and she refused because she believed in wanting to stay Egyptian and bring her research back to Egypt. I mean, I think if you were to think about her contemporaries who were also from Egyptian or other descent, who moved, specifically Eastern Europeans during that time, moved to America and actually stayed there and decided to naturalize. But she didn't, or at least she was 35 at the time. Potentially she would have, who knows? But what's more important for me is, and how does this kind of apply in terms of when we think about her personal traits? We spoke about her ability to have problem solving skills, critical thinking, clarity of thought, her her ability potentially to collaborate and teamwork and assimilate data collectively as a group, but also individually as a person, just trying to deep down in understanding what the data means and really trying to zone in. I do believe she also had a strong ethical, or should I say, I wouldn't say moral because moral I think speaks about something else, but there's a need for having ethics when you do research and when you're trying to achieve a specific goal that is supposedly a benefit for all. The ethical part of your research basically speaks to you understanding that even though nobody is watching, you are able to be your best critic. Or should I say, you are able to be your own critic. That's quite interesting. And the reason why it's interesting because I had to go through that and I had to learn what that means. I had to basically be the one who does the research without the help of others. Of course, you can get help from your supervisor and so forth who will eventually review. But before it gets to that stage, and in general, that's what a professional does. And some of you know this, right? Before you send out a document, you need to proofread it. And proofreading, in a sense, is trying to answer specific questions about the intent of the document, the purpose, the scope, of course, the quality, and the ramification of what the document will mean if it's published and so forth. But from a research perspective, in addition to all this, what it also requires you, from an ethical perspective, it requires you to answer the question, did is there any confirmation bias in this research? Now, we don't usually ask that in a corporate world, right? In actual fact, you want bias. You want to win people over through your document and get buy-in from your superiors in relations to your marketing plan or a marketing campaign or engineering a specification documentation or whatever the case may be. You want buy-in. So there is bias because you want buy-in. But from a research perspective, you want to be you want to portray your research as unbiased as possible. What does that mean? It means that you want to focus just as much on the good progress you've made, but you also want to highlight very clearly what you didn't do and what you should have done. Now that sounds a bit limiting, self-limiting, right? But that's essentially what an ethical conduct in research requires. So much so in a research like Dr. Sameera Moussa, where she fundamentally had to show that. She had to show that ethically she followed not only a methodology that is sound, but she arrived at a conclusion that is free from bias. Hmm. Just let that sit in, because those are some principles that should apply to all of us, right? Irrespective of research, it should apply to all of us. It should require all of us to think about it, to wanna do it, and not just leave it for the researchers and the scientists to kind of go and but there is a certain training that requires all of us to really perform a certain level of thought process in our brain to basically say and be honest with ourselves and say, you know what, yeah, I missed out on doing X, Y, and Z. Now usually if your boss is understanding, you can be open with him. Sometimes he's not understanding. I've had a few of those. But what you can definitely do is mark down certain things that you should be doing. In the document, they call it, further, or in research articles, sometimes in documents, not, it's very seldom you see in documents, specifically work corporate documents, where you'll see further recommendations or you will see outstanding work. You usually don't see that because it essentially, if it's outstanding, why didn't you do it, right? So but it's important to actually have that as part of your report. It is fundamental in a research report, whether it is a graduate report after your fourth year degree or a master's dissertation after your end of your master's research, and specifically after a PhD thesis. And that PhD thesis needs to have clarity on what should be done next and what you didn't do. That, of course, if you didn't do it, potentially it should have been done. Because what it does show that you took the time to decipher the biases that potentially would have been inherent in your research, that would have potentially, I mean, of course, no research is free of bias, but what it at least tries to do, it tries to give a certain picture that there is more to be done, and the research itself was done with a sound process. So, why is this important? It's important to the story because being a tech champion and wanting to see an improvement within the African context requires those skills. I think we live in an environment where we're trying to push our agenda, we're trying to push what we believe in, we're trying to give a certain sense of who we are, to the rest of the world in a very polished way. The podcast is, of course, it's on video and just as much as it's on audio. And thank you so much for watching up on this point. But this is not a podcast where it's polished. You know, there will be ums and there will be uhs. I'm not gonna take it out. This is me, and we are talking. And if you are following, I'm so grateful for you to be watching and to be listening, wherever it may be. But we want to learn. I want to learn about the people that we call, like me, an African, that have shown what it means to achieve and wanting to achieve excellence for the benefit of not just themselves, but for the benefit of everybody else in retrospect. So, if I were to reflect on this specific tech champion, which is Dr. Sameera Moussa, and of course, we didn't really, as you can imagine, we didn't really go too deep into her research. And I mean, it would have been great if she was here, she would have spoken about it, but she's not with us. So I'm not going to do a disservice by misquoting what she actually researched and the details of it. So this is really all about a self reflection on my perception of who she was and also my perception of the personal traits that she needed in order to achieve what she achieved. And one of the questions I have in my mind is, what are the steps of achieving academic excellence? Hmm. What are the steps of achieving academic excellence? Now, what does that mean? I think we need to define what academic excellence is. Being excellent academically does not necessarily mean 100% in your test. You know why? Because academic excellence, at least for me, is easy. It could be easy for you to regurgitate, memorize and regurgitate all the answers required for a test and get 100% and completely flop at work when the very same questions are asked of you to respond. Let me say that again. It is, or let me say it in another way. I think you've heard it. If you want to rewind it, go for it. Let me say it another way. I have had the privilege or the misfortune of having to manage someone who, on paper, had A's for her computer engineering, I believe, but at work was a complete flop. How is that possible? Is that academic excellence, or could the snapshot of that person at graduation be deemed academic excellence? And then thereafter, a few years later, the snapshot of the very same person in their application of what she or he has learned be deemed a complete flop. Why would you judge that against academic excellence? And so I have my own view of what academic excellence means. Academic excellence means is your ability to be able to learn and to apply the concepts that you haven't yet mastered. For me, that's academic excellence. That you are showing that you have an ability to learn and to apply the very things that you haven't yet mastered. Why the thing that you haven't yet mastered? Because the thing that you have mastered would have come from the things that you haven't mastered, but it would have come through a learning process and an application process. So fundamentally, you would have mastered the things through learning and application, not just regurgitation, not just memory, not just, uh, what do you call these memory cards, just to get, but you would have had a feedback loop of learning and application and getting feedback on the things that you don't yet are not yet sure of, to the point where it becomes sure through learning and applying. For me, that is academic excellence. It's your ability to learn and your ability to apply again and again and again on the very things that you know you don't know very well. That potentially other people have a different opinion on this, but I do think that that resonates with me. Now we have another question that came up as I read the biography and I thought about this specific tech champions is, how does one stay true to your roots while in pursuit of greatness? How does one stay true to your roots while in pursuit of greatness? Dr. Musa was Egyptian. She was an American. She studied in London. She was not British. She went to America for research. She didn't want to stay, or at least for my understanding. She wanted to go back home. But she also knew the message she brought. I mean, there was a specific slogan, nuclear for peace, or nuclear energy for peace, um, that was used, a couple of decades later by one of the US presidents, funny enough, as a way of not of trying to circumvent the building of the nuclear bomb, which epically failed, of course, as we all know, Hiroshima. But how does she stay? How does she stay true to her roots? How does she keep the notion that she has to study, she has to research, she has to focus all her energies on finding a solution for her people and potentially the people around the world that she felt that she has a responsibility to elevate and to help? How does one stay true to those values while you are in the midst of people who are, in a way, living in their own thoughts because of their black tax? If you don't know what black tax is, it's essentially the unending need to help your family, knowing that you have the capability to help. That's it. That's how I can explain it. Maybe there's a better term, but it's unending, and it comes from your ability to help, given that, and if you have the ability to help, there's an expectation that you should. That's black tax. So from an African perspective, there is black tax. So how does one, given wherever you stay in a first world country, how does one stay true to wanting to have an impact from in terms of where you come from? Now, I would say there's a couple of things that I think helps me to stay true to my roots. One, be unashamed, unapologetic. I'm Cameroonian. Now, I'm not saying I'm the model Cameroonian. I cannot say I'm, de facto, you know, waving the flag and fundamentally showing up as knowing everything that's going on. But I love Cameroon and I love Africa and I love the concept, or at least the construct, of what African values are built upon, and they are built upon family. They're built upon the love for the mother, or the love for the woman in the family, or the love for woman and the respect for woman in the family, the matriarch, the gogo, the mfulu, the meme and pepe in Cameroonian language, the ntate, the love for that. That's being African. So how does one stay true? Be unapologetic about it. Be Set it aside to read, to converse, to laugh at the jokes, to to be within the news cycle, no matter how demoralizing it may be, don't move away. I think that's one point. Probably the one last point that I would have regarding this is, or it is specifically this question, is staying true also means you don't you don't allow yourself to to s- yeah, let me put it the other way. I think I'm also not, like I said, I also don't have all the answers yet, but I do think staying true to your roots while striving for excellence also means you consistently um examine the values that allows you to strive for excellence, and you keep those values, and you completely, and I mean completely, discard the ones that don't, even though they were the values that were passed on to you from a cultural perspective. What do I mean by that? Let me take myself, for example. They are values that are well known, or habits. Actually, you can call it values. There are values that are well known within the francophone culture, that essentially puts a lot of weight and emphasis on dressing well. Some of you who are francophone, African, Cote d'Ivoire, Cameroon, um, Congo, Brazza, Congo, Kinshasa, you will know, there's a word for it, and French, maybe to a lesser extent, French in a sense, from France, where the dress code is all about who you are, you know. On a pesa, we call that sape, tu as la sape. But at the same time, that could be your downfall because you put a lot of emphasis, and your value system is very much centralized around materialistic things. And it's very difficult to achieve excellence if all that you are, all that is driving you forward, or a large part of what is driving you forward, is you holding on to what potentially, and I'm not saying it's impossible to have both, but what I'm trying to get at least for me, is if that holds you back, and if that is a huge part of your budget, for example, whereby you are not able to study because you are spending so much money on clothes so that you can go out with your friends and so forth, that is a value that you gotta discard. But guess what? That is also a value. Discarding that value is also a way of staying close to your roots, because your roots essentially are asking you, how can you have more impact? And the only way you can have more impact is if you consistently strive for excellence. So fundamentally, you got to lose a little bit of your culture in order for you to have impact in the people that are culturally the same as you, but not as privileged. Just think about that. Actually, I just thought about it now. Is that for me, and of course I'm doing it, but I never really framed it in that way. And I do believe Samira Moussa was also the same. And there's so many academics who really had to go through this transformation of still being part of the country, but not yet identifying with everything and all the values that the average citizen of that country really holds to heart. Because that's the only way for you to consistently attain excellence while not having values or specific habits that pulls you back. Okay. Now, this is again, it's just really about the framing of the Dr. Samira Moussa story. Now, if I were to kind of bring this home, if I were to think about the admirable qualities that Dr. Samira Moussa possesses, that when I look at myself, what admirable qualities does she possess that potentially are absent or are limited by my beliefs? I'm gonna say it again. What are the qualities that Dr. Samira Musa possessed? And this is now hypothetical, of course. She's not here to answer. And of course, it is also a reflection for me and for you. Of course, just think about it. Take some time to think about it as you've heard the story, and I encourage you to research even more. But just think about this. What are the admirable qualities that she could have had and that she had, I'm assuming, that are either limited or absent because of the thing that I believe in? Now, I can answer for two things. One, I still have a huge amount of self-doubt. Huge amount of self-doubt. I doubt that this podcast would be a success. I doubt that I'm just rambling on because I can. I have doubt oftentimes because of my backstory as an immigrant. I do believe immigrants in general have a lot of self-doubt by the virtue that you're an immigrant, but you can also have additional self-doubt depending on where you, as an immigrant, where is your story coming from and how did you get to where you got to with respect to the people that you've left behind. And if that gap, in my view, is bigger, I think the doubt is potentially even higher. So I do have a lot of self-doubt in being able to sustain and be able to keep where the trajectory of where my career is going and where I would like it to go. And I do believe it's a limiting factor in the qualities of courage and the qualities of being clear and wanting to show to the world that you can and are willing to do and have an impact. Those doubts definitely are something that consistently I'm aware of and I need to be working on. And this is one of the stories that really helps me to galvanize the fire of wanting to work on those self doubts. The second thing that I think in terms of belief system that is limiting to have some admirable qualities is I think I often believe that there's a limit to how much work you need to do before you become a master of something. What do I mean by that? I do believe that I arrive more often than not at the belief that I have mastered something even before I think I should have done, even before I actually did the reps that justifies that belief. So what do I mean by that? How do I can put it a bit simpler. I often believe that, for a very blunt example, I've mastered a book of finance just because I've read it once and because I read it carefully. I've mastered the book. So I don't really go back to it or I don't really refer to it. I don't really pick it up a month or two later. I believe I can speak truth based on that book. And I don't believe that that's who she was. I do believe that she was an incredible, she had incredible work ethic. She assessed her observations again and again and again and again and again, almost to nausea. And only when she was 100% sure, and potentially someone else told us that it was 100% the way she thought, only then she felt that she actually was moving forward. And I find that trap oftentimes in my belief system. How do you know that it's a belief system? It's when you act it out. It's when, for example, for me, is I just made an example of a book. It's when you read a book and The book clearly gives you guidelines that you should follow. And the book potentially also give you exercises that you should come back, in the appendix of the book and say, hey, answer these questions. I'll hardly do it because in my mind, the belief system is that I've read the book. I know what's going on in the book. I'm a master of what, and I've seen it all the time on social media, and potentially you've seen it as well, where someone speaks of a book and they've mastered it, the 34, the third, the 30 books to become a millionaire and blah, blah, blah. And fundamentally, they give a perception that they've read the book, they know the book, they summarize the book, and they can speak truth to the book without having to go back to the book. My belief system tells me I can do the same, but my understanding of what other people do to master tells me my belief system is wrong, and I need to change it. I get it right sometimes, but oftentimes I don't. At least the actions that follow don't show that I get it right. So those are potentially the two things that I think are limiting in achieving some of the qualities that I see in Dr. Musa. So lastly, I do think there is a specific question that we need to frame regarding what we've learned is, from a Molo Molo philosophy, which means, take it slowly, take it gradually, think it through, try to figure out what it means from an African context, and not just rush through in implementing or in saying or in doing. How does the story apply? I do think the Samira story gives is synonymous to what Molo Molo is trying to convey to myself and to you who's listening and watching this, is that nothing comes for free, but also things that are meant to be for free takes a heck of a lot of work to make it free or to make it cheap. The fact that an X-ray machine is available to in the most obscure village in Timbuktu, or in the most obscure village in Eastern Cape, or I don't know, in Chad, it's because of the incredible amount of hours that were spent by people like Dr. Samira Moussa, which speaks the very philosophy of Molo Molo, which is for things to be accessible, for things to be impactful and long lasting, they have to be taken with care, time, methodically, and with the unrelenting will of not allowing your bias to stop you from moving this subject forward. That is the story of Dr. Samira Moussa. I hope you've been inspired. This was essentially the first champion that, in my view, inspired me, resonates with me. Hopefully, it resonated with you. This was a story of Dr. Samira Moussa, who fundamentally can be summarized as a person who dedicated her life toward the nuclear research with the exceptional belief that her research will be producing an amazing technology that will be reached throughout the African continent and the rest of the world. And she achieved it. She was a woman. She had so many firsts. She was a first in so many ways. But more importantly, I do believe that she had amazing qualities that we can all learn from. So, and this was therapeutic for me to kind of go through it, to reflect on it, but also to figure out what does that mean going forward. So that's it. Thank you for listening, and thank you for watching. If you're watching this on video, this is Molo Molo African Tech Stories, the show where you discover with me the incredible stories of African tech champions and innovators that are shaping the future of the African continent. I'm Polan Kantoe. Please don't be shy to subscribe and share this episode to whoever will be keen and willing to listen and to watch this. And I'll see you on the next one. Ciao.